Hey there. I'm waiting for the Facebook folks to check in so I know I'm live there as well. And somebody had a question for me to start with from there. So here we go. Here's somebody from the San Juan Mountains. Here we go. Here comes Facebook. Welcome, everybody. Who have we got from where? Hey, Emma, how are you? Conway, South Carolina. I've been to Conway, South Carolina. Now I can't remember why. Cincinnati. Been there too, actually. Walpole, Mass, been there too. Grand Rapids, Michigan, been there too. I've traveled a lot in the last several years. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, Connecticut, West Virginia. Oh, what a pretty state. Baton Rouge. Oh, I have a very soft spot in my heart for Baton Rouge. Northwest Harbor, Southwest Harbor. California, Delaware. All right. So while people are filing in, let me answer an easy question that somebody asked that has nothing really to do with today's politics. And that's that you asked about what seemed to be boxes on the floor of the Old North Church in Boston when I gave the lecture there the other night on April 18th. And yes, that's why I was frantic last week, is that I was very happy with the way the speech went, but a speech like that, part of the way that you make it look easy is by working incredibly hard on it. So that took a huge amount of my time. And I wanted to do it because of it's special, the 250th anniversary of the hanging of the lanterns in the steeple and then Paul Revere's ride. That was really important to me. Anyway, the boxes are actually called box pews. And the reason that they are like that is because that's quite an old church and there was not central heating when that church was built. So what a family would do, and these would be wealthy families, they could buy a box pew and then they would, or rent it. I guess you couldn't carry it with you, but they would rent it and then they could put their own furniture in it. And, so they were decorated all differently, but you would also bring, and you can see these sometimes in old, antique stores, sometimes even in thrift stores, you would bring in a metal box that had coals in it so that you could have heat at your feet while you listened to the sermons, which went on for, a couple hours. So the reason that they're boxes is because that's how you held in the heat. And if you probably couldn't see in the dark there, but some of the pews are decorated as they originally were or similarly. And all the pews have the option of having seats around them, like wooden seats, but some of them actually have like armchairs in them. Because I guess if you were a rich sea captain, you'd be like, if I'm going to sit here for 2 hours, I'm going to be comfortable. And so you'd bring in not a lazy boy, but whatever passed in that day for a comfortable chair. So that's why those were set up that way. That's why they looked that way, and they were different cost depending on where the pew was, the box pew was, and I don't know if you saw me motioning to where Robert Newman, the sexton, as in the caretaker, would have worshipped. His was provided by the church as part of his job, and it was fairly large, but it was behind the minister, so it wasn't as good a seat as somebody like John Pulling would have had, or somebody in the middle of the church who could have looked straight at the minister and seen the minister more clearly. That kind of a pulpit on which I was standing is the very traditional pulpit. They did ask me to go up there, but I was happy to do it because you see them in those old churches and you see them in old literature, and in the idea is you're speaking to the flock. Now above that, which you may or may not have seen, I haven't actually watched the video, are balconies, and the balconies have just benches. And so they would have been very cold, although the heat would have risen to some degree up there, but the poorer people sat up there in the balconies. And that's the story of that. All right. So that was an easy one to answer. And, someday I will get to do nothing but history, and then you all don't have to listen to me. Although if you saw what happened to me the other day when I tried to talk about history with Senator Angus King, perhaps it will be worthwhile to tune into those. For those of you who didn't see it, we were supposed to be having a conversation about Paul Revere's ride. He's a senator who cares a great deal about history. And it was supposed to be, I was told it was going to be about Paul Revere's ride. And he just sort of said, hold my beer, and unloaded for 45 minutes on his Republican colleagues in the Senate. And, we started with very few viewers. And as the news got out, they went up and up and up. And now, of course, it's been widely watched. But boy, it was it was something. All right, so I'm going to start with something that you didn't necessarily want, that you didn't necessarily ask about. But I think one of the things that I find anyway in this moment is there is so much going on. It's really hard to know what to pay attention to. So I'm going to give you a very broad overview of what I see is happening, and then get more into the details of what you asked, just because, at least for me, I don't know about you, I open the news up in the morning and it's like, oh, really? I didn't think about that. Oh, really? Here's this over there. It helps for me anyway to have a framework. So one of the things that I feel is worth emphasizing in this moment is that, in my observation, the president, Donald J. Trump, is not really in control of his administration. He doesn't really seem to be much more than a figurehead. And I am getting that not only from watching him for all these decades, but also from the fact that he doesn't seem to be able to carry through an idea. If you listen to him at press conferences, he usually defers more complicated questions to a member of his cabinet who's there. And by the way, it's not at all common for presidents to have members of their cabinet there when they are talking to the press. And it's also not common to have that many press availabilities in the Oval Office. Those are usually somewhere else. Occasionally you would have them when there was a visiting dignitary, but this is really quite unusual. So he often has somebody else answer the questions, and he often says he doesn't know about something major, or that he didn't have anything to do with something major, even though his name is on it. And as I say, if you actually listen to him, not the cuts that are in the media, and this is one of the reasons when I write about him, I often put the whole paragraph in there, he does not have a coherent train of thought. And that's different than in the past. And I can hear, even though I can't see this here, somebody would say, well, he was always all over the map. That's true. But first of all, it wasn't true in the 80s. It was true in 2016. But what he did do very well in 2016 is, it was I thought of it kind of like impressionism. He gave you the right words and the right symbols so that you could get a sense of something, even if it didn't feel like an argument. He's not doing that now. Now it's just a litany of his grievances, and they're not necessarily in any kind of order. Anyway, all that to say, I don't think he's really the one behind what's happening in the administration. He cares about looking good. He cares about staying out of prison, and he wants lots and lots and lots of money. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. So if he's not really in charge of things, who is? There are three, I think, factions in the administration right now. And that's not to say they're exclusive. They do overlap in some ways, but it's very hard sometimes to watch what's happening with the undocumented immigrants and then turn around and see what's happening in a different part of the administration. And I think the reason for that is because there's different impulses. So the three groups I'm going to identify here are, first of all, what I would call the Project 2025 group. And those are the people who were associated with those who wrote Project 2025. And Project 2025, as you know, comes from the Heritage Foundation. They were the leading group of the more than 100 who participated in that. And they are Christian nationalists. They want to get rid of the U.S. government altogether, not just put Republicans where there used to be Democrats, get rid of the U.S. government, business, education, science, innovation, all of those things, because they feel that they have been tainted by this liberal, secular way of thought. So they want to get rid of all of it. So that's the Project 2025 people. And that's a lot of the executive orders you see coming out. So for example, the idea of getting rid of words like gender, or words like, and now I can't think of a single other one, gay, lesbian, diversity. Diversity is a big one, because that really hit the sciences hard, because if you're looking at a diversity of answers, you're in real trouble on that one. So that's the kind of stuff you're seeing from them, sort of the social culture wars stuff, get rid of people that are in the federal government. This is Schedule F, which somebody asked me to define. Schedule F is an attack that Trump started at the end of his first term that reclassifies public workers, people who are working in the federal government, I'm sorry, civil service workers, it reclassifies them so that, as you also probably know, since 1883, we have had a nonpartisan civil service. So what that meant was that it didn't matter if you were a Republican or a Democrat if you went to work for the government, with the exception of a very few, I think it's about 4,000 political positions at the very top. So that's going to be people like, a cabinet member, and 4,000 people in that upper staff, which are considered sort of the president's own picks. The rest of them, it didn't matter what your politics were. You could work for the government so long as you could do your job, and that starts in 1883. Well, Schedule F takes almost all of those employees and reclassifies them so that they can be fired for political reasons, and you can only pack those seats with political people. And so that's Project 2025, because their goal is to overturn democracy and put in place one very strong executive, one very strong president. And then once they have that very strong president, get rid of the equality that is a hallmark of democracy, get rid of rights for women, rights for Black and brown people, gender and religious minorities, and instead impose Christian nationalism. So that's what you're seeing there with the people who are what I would call Project 2025 people. And the person in charge of that in the White House appears to be Russell Vought, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget. And you might sit there and think, why is that important? The Office of the Office of Management and Budget, there we go, OMB. The Office of Management and Budget is the one that disperses the monies that Congress has appropriated for something. So it's a pinch point, and that's exactly how Vought has used it, is to pinch off money to places that he doesn't want money to go. And this is absolutely illegal and unconstitutional before somebody asks. And this is what Trump was impeached for the first time he was impeached in 2019 and then acquitted in 2020. He refused to disperse the monies that Congress had appropriated for Ukraine to fight back against Russia's attacks of 2014, the first time it invaded, at least in recent memory. It invaded a lot of times in the past too. Anyway, so that's the Project 2025 group. Then there's what I would call the broligarchs, the tech bros. They're latecomers to MAGA, but they have made friends with the 2025 people, or made common cause with them, because they too want to get rid of the US government. And the reason they want to get rid of the US government is because they don't want regulations. They really hate the idea that the government can say to Elon Musk, for example, no, you can't explode your rockets in FAA territory or whatever, because they believe that they have a vision for the future that will significantly help humanity. And it will help humanity by getting rid of states, getting rid of, all sorts of, by creating this new technocracy. And also by, Elon Musk wants us to get it to interplanetary travel. That I'm not going to go into today, but maybe someday. They believe that the government is standing in their way by requiring that they follow environmental laws, that they don't practice discriminatory hiring, that they have to pay taxes, all the things that they feel is standing between them and the ability to be as innovative and as creative as they would like. And you have people like Peter Thiel, who's also a billionaire, saying things like democracy and something, and capital. Basically, he wants to get rid of democracy. I'm sorry, I just did another long podcast, so I'm a little vague on some of my quotations, but the idea that you have to get rid of democracy because that's stopping the great men from doing what they could do if they weren't having to answer to the environment, for example. So you got those two groups, and they want to destroy the government. But now what's happening over here with immigrants and with the truly horrific stuff that is going on with undocumented immigrants and their rendition, not deportation back to their home countries, but their rendition to a prison, a notorious prison in a third country. That's a different group of people, and they appear to be led by Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, who has this real intense desire to get rid of at least immigrants from American society. The limits of what Miller thinks are unclear to me, but he believes that having what he would call, I'm not going to say it, having immigrants in our society is poisoning society, and it is imperative to get rid of them at all costs. And in order to do that, he requires an extremely strong state. So you got the two anti-staters, the one stater, but all of them can agree that if they have essentially a dictator in place, they can get what they want. And so this is the larger game behind what you're seeing. All right, now let me go ahead and pull these things apart a little bit. So where am I going to start? I'm going to start with, let's start with Stephen Miller. So what the administration is arguing with its rendition of at least 278 men. One of the things that's very hard about this administration is they are deliberately keeping everything invisible. So, now I long for it, but it was a bit of a complaint for me about the Biden administration is that, they had press conferences every day. They published every kind of thing they did was up on the internet. If I wanted to know who spoke to whom at a certain time, it was public information. You could find it. Now I'm sitting here going, I don't know how many men went to El Salvador, which is bonkers for a government in the 21st century to do, unless they're a government that's disappearing people. And that's worth holding in your heads. Anyway, at least 278 apparently men. They sent women, but they got returned because CCOT, that terrorist prison in El Salvador, doesn't accept women, were sent from the United States to El Salvador, to this prison in El Salvador. Now, there's so many problems with this, I have a hard time putting them in order. But let me start with the concept of due process. So what we have in the United States, and one of the reasons that we picked a fight with, maybe that's the wrong way to put it, we went to war with King George III, was because he was denying Americans due process, the due process of the law. What that means is that it is central to America's rule of law. Remember, we're a country that does not depend on religion or on nationality or any number of these things. We are based in the law. As Thomas Paine said, in America, the law is king. So, so what that, excuse me. So what that means is that you have the right to answer to the law if somebody accuses you of something. And what does that mean? That means the government cannot just pick you up and throw you in jail. If it does, a lawyer can go to the government or to a judge and say, we want that person back. It's called habeas corpus, if you've seen that word, which literally means free the body. The government cannot hold you indefinitely without charging you with something. And if the government doesn't charge you, it has to let you go. So, for example, one of the things that you saw in the Black Lives Matter protests during the pandemic was you get these, when Trump was in office, is you'd get these reports of how many people were arrested. And that was what made the American papers. But a study by The Guardian showed that virtually all of those people were let go the next day because they didn't charge them with anything. They were just trying to get them off the streets and to try and make it look like there was a really violent events going on, knowing that most people wouldn't wait to see who was charged. Most of those people were never charged. I want to say the rates were in the high 90%. You could look that up. It's on the internet. Anyway, under The Guardian, they're the ones that did the study. Quite a thorough study. Anyway, so the government has to charge you if it arrests you. And then it has to give you the right to a trial. Now, it's actually sort of a problem in our society that only about 2 to 3% of criminal charges currently go to trial. And there's a bunch of people trying to fix that. But that's, again, a rabbit hole I'm not going to go into. You have the right to have a trial. And that means that you have the right to present testimony, you have the right to present evidence, and very crucially, you are presumed innocent unless the government can prove its case against you to the satisfaction of a jury of your peers. What that means, and you see this sometimes, is people feel like individuals who they think did something, and I can certainly think of cases, very public cases that I would think of like that, um, they get off. And the reason for that is because the government did not prove its case. And you might, if you've been on jury duty, you might know of things like that where, the case didn't get proved. And you're like, okay, I can't go just on what this police officer said or whatever, because the government did not prove its case. And that really matters. That really matters, because if you do not have due process, that means that a leader can simply do all those things: arrest you, hold you in prison indefinitely. Look, for example, at a country like Russia, and it can also frame you, and then it can also simply throw you indefinitely into prison or do something else to you. I mean, one of the things that, well, maybe I'll talk about that in a second. So one of the things that you're seeing right now with the Trump administration is they're trying to insist that Kilmar Abrego Garcia is, and they've got a whole list of epithets that they are accusing him of, including human trafficking. There is this much evidence for that. There is literally zero evidence for that. But they're trying to convince people that those of us who are trying to protect due process are simply trying to flood the country with rapists and murderers and so on, which is just stupid. I mean, think about your lifetime. Have you ever heard anybody say, hey, here's a great idea, let's get more murderers in the neighborhood? I mean, literally nobody does that. But they're trying to make people think that so that they get rid of the concept of due process. And the reason that due process matters is because once you have said that it is okay for a leader to grab someone off the street and throw them in prison in El Salvador and just say, well, he was a criminal, where are you going to draw that line? And I would like to remind you that it's not even been a week, I don't think, since President Trump has declared that two people who were in his first term, in his first administration, his own appointees or hires in one case, have broken the law. And he accused one of possibly being a traitor, having treasonous behavior, for publishing a book that was critical of Trump. The other one is in trouble with Trump because he said that the 2020 election was secure. He is now going after them with the power of the government. Now, fine, except he is simply declaring these men are traitors or criminals or rapists or murderers or child traffickers, and there is no evidence. All right, so what we are seeing then is an attack on the idea of due process. And once we have given up the idea of due process, none of us gets it. None of us gets it. Now, think there for a second about your own life, things you might have said, for example. And imagine if that could be weaponized against you by a leader who didn't like you. And I think for a lot of us, the answer is yeah. But in America, we can say whatever we want. We have the right to criticize our leaders. We have a right to be a member of a different political party. We have a right to gather peacefully. We have a right to protest. We have all those rights, but Trump is trying to say, I get to determine who's a criminal. And then I get to send them to a third country. And crucially, he is doing so in a funny way for this reason. In Donald J. Trump versus US, the Supreme Court case that was handed down on July 1st, 2024, in which the Supreme Court said that a president could not be prosecuted for official acts committed during his presidency, for official acts. One of the big exceptions, one of the big things they were talking about there was foreign affairs, saying that the president gets to manage foreign affairs, which Article 2 does establish. What Trump has said is that by sending people in this country, and by the way, due process is not just for citizens. The Constitution says any person in the United States. By sending people outside US jurisdiction into the jurisdiction of a foreign country, or apparently international jurisdictions, he is saying the US courts can't touch that because that's foreign affairs. That's his bailiwick. And as scholars have pointed out, quite literally, this means that he could take his political opponents, put them in a helicopter, take them out over the ocean and push them out and say, I'm allowed to do it. It's foreign affairs. And the reason that I use that example, although that is not my initial example, that was another scholar who said that, is because it made me think of those T-shirts that Trump supporters were wearing in 2016 that offered helicopter rides to Democrats. And that's a reflection of, that's a echo of the Pinochet years, where Pinochet, who was a dictator, would take his political opponents, he wouldn't personally do it, would have his political opponents taken out and pushed out of helicopters to kill them. And that is exactly what this means. It's not just about, what about these 278 men or however many they are? And by the way, it's not just Abrego Garcia who did not get his due process. The rest of them didn't either. They all have the right to due process. This is not just about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's an easy person for people to look at because he was literally in the country legally. You know, he was allowed to be here. He had a work permit from the Department of Homeland Security. You know, he was allowed to be here. So he's an easy person to look at. And we're seeing as well, of course, ICE picking up American citizens now as well. And, you know, you can just see where this is going. All right. That assault on due process is really important because it's an attack on the rule of law. And once we get rid of the rule of law, everything else goes too. And one of the things that's worth thinking about as you try and conceptualize what's going on here is that the Trump administration is not so much just breaking the law, it's operating outside the law. It's operating as if there is not a constitution. One of the reasons it's been so hard to pick up people like Elon Musk is because there's no role for him. There's nothing that no precedent where we say, well, this guy has to behave this way. He's not supposed to be there. So it's a little bit like there's the Constitution and they're just saying, we're blowing on by that. We're not going to act with regard to the Constitution. And you can see that with the attack on the rule of law and of due process. All right. So now that I've established that and the attack on the rule of law, let's take a look at what is happening in other aspects of the administration, especially with regard to the Department of Government Efficiency, which again is not an official agency, which must be created by Congress. I mean, don't lose sight of the fact this is not in normal behavior. This is not in constitutional behavior. One of the things that has really always jumped out to me about them is that while they talk about eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, which is a legalese term, a government term, they immediately got rid of all the inspectors general, who's not all of them, most of the inspectors general, whose job it is to go after waste, fraud, and abuse. And they acted, and many Americans seem to have thought that we didn't already have a system in place to find waste, fraud, and abuse, which was our Government Accountability Office, which does constant inspections. And similarly, we also had divisions in the FBI that went after healthcare fraud, for example, things like that. They tore all those apart and instead sent into individual agencies these computer guys who were not auditors. They had no experience in government. And instead they appeared from the beginning to make a beeline for information, for databases. And this was a huge red flag for me because databases, you know, it's worth thinking about how power works in a society. And if you think about it, the ultimate power is knowledge, knowing stuff. That's why I'm always so outraged when politicians lie to us, because they have taken away your right to make informed decisions about your lives. And knowing stuff, having knowledge, is crucial to power. And one of the things about these attacks today on the State Department is that's our knowledge base of other countries. They're not just getting rid of people or structures. They're making it so we know less. And similarly, the attacks on research and on science and all of the aspects in which the government is going after stuff, they're hurting our ability to know stuff. And once you can't know stuff, you can't make good decisions and you also can't move forward. So just as a little bit as an aside for you to maybe be able to remember that better. The idea of knowledge, of knowing stuff so you can make good decisions or so that you understand your own life is really central to much of literature. So you think of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, that's all about who knows what, right? Or even more powerfully, one of the first novels to really encapsulate that is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It's all a question of who has what knowledge in that book, right? Having knowledge is going to make people be able to make good decisions about their lives. And there are ways in which there are different characters in that book who consistently withhold certain pieces of knowledge that cause trouble for other people in the book, including um, Mr. Bennet, who's really not good about sharing knowledge that he has. So, I mean, that's kind of his power trip. He's always got all the knowledge going on. So that idea of them going straight for databases really worried me because one of the ways in which data has been weaponized against Americans recently was in 2016 with the Cambridge Analytica a company that gathered data from people on Facebook to create profiles of them and then to bombard them with very subtly with information that made them turn against Democratic presidential candidate Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and toward Donald Trump. And we know this happened. We know that the Russians helped this. We know the Russians did the same thing. We know that the Russians have been doing it since then. And, you know, the idea of using information and targeting people in order to change the way people think so they are no longer operating with good information. So I was very concerned about that from the start, but we are beginning to see what they might do with that information. And that is, Trump had an executive order in which he told the different silos of information in the government to start sharing information with each other, which sounds like it would make sense in business perhaps. But one of the reasons that the government silos information is that so that you cannot create thorough composite pictures of individual Americans, the way, for example, China has done of its citizens. Well, Trump has said, stop siloing this information. We want it to be put together. And we are seeing it being put together in these moments, really, what are we in April now? Really since March, of what is essentially a master database of the information that the US government holds about American citizens and being able to marry it all together. So think about the ways in which you engage with the federal government. So when you pay your taxes, you got your date of birth, you've got your job information, you have information about your home, you have information about taxes you might have paid on other on a vehicle or something. You've got tons of information, and that's just in your taxes. Then you've also got Social Security. They've got a different, they've known where you've worked and where you've lived. You've got more in different silos of information, but we have privacy laws to make sure that's not shared. Because if you start to share it and you put all those little pieces of information together, you start to be able to say, oh, even if that's randomized, I have a pretty good idea of who Heather Cox Richardson is, because I can see, if she took time off to have a baby, if she, all the different things that might create a life. Well, this appears to be what the Department of Government Efficiency is doing. And there's the argument that they are making, to the degree they're even bothering to make it, is that this will enable them to go after undocumented immigrants by looking at their Social Security information and so on. And again, undocumented immigrants cannot take Social Security. But if they are working above the table, they're going to be paying Social Security taxes. It's one of the things that people don't pay a lot of attention to. They're putting a lot of money in that they are not taking out. So the argument is that they're going to be able to find undocumented immigrants more easily. But just as an example of what one could do with this information, one of the ways that the Miller wing of the administration is trying to get individuals to self-deport is by doing what's called financial murder. That is declaring them dead in the databases. Well, if you're dead, you can't use a credit card, You can't, I mean, think of all the things you cannot do if you're dead. You can't get money from a bank to tide you over. You are a non-person because they have declared you dead, and the work of trying to prove that you are alive will take the rest of your life. This happened to a man in on the West Coast, an 82-year-old man that they declared was dead, and he was a Social Security recipient. They clawed back his money from Social Security, and he couldn't get money to tide him over. Fortunately, he was married, and his wife had income, and they could manage to start to bring him to life again. But he says he's still fighting it all the time, trying to say, well, no, actually, I'm not dead. Aside from any of the psychological stuff about that, it matters that you are not declared dead, because all of a sudden everything changes when you're not there. Well, so if you have this database, it's got all that information on all of us. You don't actually need to dump somebody out of a helicopter. You could simply say, I'm just going to declare that person dead, or I'm just going to claw money out of their bank accounts, or there's any number of things you could do with that knowledge base, with that base, to go after an individual, or a series of individuals. And then, of course, you could also really affect the way that they act politically, because you could use that information to feed them the kind of stuff that Cambridge Analytica did in 2016. All right, so if that's what they are doing, is building this database, I want to go a little bit further on that. There is news as of yesterday, I think it was, that the Department of Health and Human Services under Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the secretary of that department, is getting access to health records in order to aggregate those health records, because he says he wants to put together a database of people who have been diagnosed with autism. And first of all, our health information is private. There's a law about that. And I suspect they're going to make the argument that it's going to be shielded, so you couldn't tell who those people are. But if you put it in that master database, pretty quickly you will be able to figure out who those individuals are. But even before we get to that, the idea of the government keeping a database of our health is off the charts unacceptable, because aside from the fact that autism is Robert Kennedy's big source of income, basically, think about all of the ways that you do not want your government to know about your health. Even if you're healthy as a horse, I'm a little bit unable to articulate just what a bad idea that is. Because if they know about your health, they could decide they want to change something about your health. And, there was already somebody talking today about how people who are obese and on EBT cards should not be able to buy sodas, for example. That idea that the government could say to you, Heather, I'm worried about your blood pressure, and so I think I'm going to make sure you can't eat in a certain way. Or I'm going to, I'm taking a look at you and I'm thinking, you got a bad heart and you're kind of old. I don't think we're going to cover your health care anymore. It's not worth it. You're on your own. I mean, I'm not saying they're going to do that, but I'm saying that this is the good case scenario of what happens when a government starts to make lists of people according to medical diagnoses. And I'm being very careful not to say medical conditions, but medical diagnoses, because, of course, you don't have to look even that far back in our own history to the 1970s, to when Indigenous American women, the government sterilized them because they thought that it would be better for them and for their people for them not to reproduce. And of course, that goes all the way back to the early 20th century. But that practice of sterilization of Indigenous American women lasted until the 1970s. So this idea of getting into these databases, breaking through privacy walls and gathering these things together is, as I like to say, a whole factory of red flags. And I'm going to come back in a second to what one does about that. But what else? Trump does not care about somebody's autism diagnosis or obesity or heart disease, or he just doesn't care about that stuff. So what's he in this for? And what is Doge in this for? Musk may or may not care about that either. One of the other things that we are seeing is that the Department of Government Efficiency is going into these government systems, essentially breaking them and then privatizing them. And you have seen this in the last few days in the attempt to get rid of the existing government payment system for those hundreds of billions of dollars a year, as in government contracts, the sharing of money. And you will remember, of course, that the first place the Department of Government Efficiency went to was the GSA, the General Services Administration, which handles all of that money. They are talking about getting rid of the system that's already in place and giving it out to a private company as a contract. And the private company that is in the lead for getting that, and it's really the only one they're considering, is called RAMP, which is a funny name, RAMP. And of course, that's funded by the same people who are associated with Trump and Musk. So essentially, it looks like what they are doing is they are trying to dismantle the government and, as so many of us said, sell it for parts. Now, equally as dramatically, I think, is that last week, I've lost a little bit of track of time, but it was last week, I think April 14th, the Secretary of the Department of the Interior, Doug Burgum, former governor of North Dakota, essentially handed the Department of Government Efficiency control over the Department of the Interior. Again, with the idea he was going to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. But it certainly looks like the Department of Government Efficiency might very well be on track to sell off the public lands. You know, that's one of my big things. And one of the reasons it's one of my big things is because we can rebuild a lot of the systems that the Department of Government Efficiency is destroying. Once they've sold off the public lands, we are not getting them back. I'm going to be writing about this tonight, actually. And the person from the Department of Government Efficiency who is now in charge essentially of the Department of the Interior, and by that I mean the budget and the personnel, basically all of it, is an oil and gas guy. And so that's another place where essentially we seem to be the administration seems to be handing the government over to this group of people to chop it up and sell it for parts. It's rather like taking your absolutely priceless Stradivarius, which is the American government, and saying, let's just chop it up and we can sell the strings over here and we can sell the wood over here and we can sell the pegs over here and we can all get it and then nobody else has it anymore. That's kind of, I think, what we're looking at. So that is I think the picture, the larger picture of what these different groups are intending to do, with the exception, I didn't pick up, again, Project 2025, but you can see that in not only the destruction we've seen, but they are now starting to talk about what they want to see come next. And they're talking about things like rewarding women for having more children. I got a sneaking suspicion those awards are not going to go to brown-skinned or black-skinned people, but to white people, because this is a policy that's actually straight out of Nazi Germany. So there's this idea to start to build that Christian society they want. And just today, I think it was, I've lost track of time, the VA is actually asking people who work there to report each other if they have heard language that reflects badly on Christianity. They're trying to police people's speech. And I think you're seeing that coming from them as well. All right. Now, let me see. I've actually covered a lot here. So here we go. What do we do? People have asked some very basic questions. Is it possible for the Supreme Court to overturn its immunity decision? Yes, you'd have to have another case brought in front of it. Is this court going to do it? Probably not. But the Supreme Court is getting really testy with the Trump administration because the Trump administration is openly thumbing its nose at the courts. And let me back up for just a second here, because I've just painted a really frightening, terrible picture here for you. And now I'm going to switch to the other side of it. This has happened very quickly. We're not even 100 days into this administration. A lot of people were taken flat-footed. They didn't expect this to happen as quickly as it did. That being said, the administration is in complete disarray. When I told you about those three different groups, they do not like each other. They sometimes work together, but Musk actually went public with his complaints about Peter Navarro, Trump's trade advisor, who is the on the Project 2025 side of MAGA. You've got Musk also going to war with the Stephen Miller group, because he wants immigrants and they want to get rid of immigrants. They can't agree on messaging. They sent out the thing against Harvard, and then they said, oopsie poopsie, we didn't mean to. Now Harvard is suing them. They're backing off stuff. They're launching stuff. They're backing off of stuff. Nobody gets along. And the Department of Defense is crumbling before our eyes with Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, who is wildly unqualified. Incredibly ironically, he kept saying that he was going to, make the department great after the DEI hires who were, crackerjack good and qualified for the position. He is of course running it through the mud, because he is doing things like sharing sensitive, classified, and even secret information on an unsecure app on an unsecure phone. More pennies dropped in that case again today. And the Pentagon, which after all is supposed to protect us, that is the government's real first line of what they're supposed to do is protect the country, it's in shambles. And that's devastating and terrifying, and we should not accept that in any way. So although I've just told you how frightening things are, this is not a juggernaut of people who cannot be stopped. They're in fact themselves in great disarray. They're not good at their jobs. One of the hallmarks of a dictator is people cling to them because they couldn't get jobs through merit in an actual meritocracy. So they hold onto somebody's coattails. That means they're very loyal, which is one of the reasons that strong men like to have people like that. But they don't know what they're doing for the most part. And they have to keep around the other people who do know what they're doing to keep things moving forward. And of course, Trump slashed through that like a hot knife through butter. So there's this real disarray going on. But there's also another huge problem for the administration. And that's that Trump really won election on a number of things, but one of them was simply that people were upset about the inflation that happened after the pandemic, the worst of the pandemic, and the media really hammered on that without talking about the fact that manufacturing jobs were actually growing at an astounding rate in the US, and the facts that real wages were going up for the bottom, I think it was 80% of American people. And, there was all sorts of things that they should have emphasized and didn't. I talked about them if you read me. But Americans, like in many other people in many other countries, simply were like, we're sick of this guy. We want the next guy. He's going to be better. We'll be fine. But then Trump also promised different things to different people, which is making it very hard for him now because he can't do those things. You can't do can't be wet and dry at the same time. But also his real advantage was he convinced people that he was going to be really good on immigration and he was going to be really good on the economy. Now, if you look at the polls, and I don't trust polls really at all. I certainly don't trust election polls, but they do give you a sense of how things are trending. And one of the things that you will read in a lot of current accounts is that people like what Trump is doing on immigration. And he says that, but that's actually not what the polls show. The polls show that Americans want undocumented immigrants who have committed crimes to be deported. And 81% of Americans want that. Now, we, of course, had that system in place long before Trump. We do deport those people. They serve their sentences and so on. I can go a little bit more into the weeds on that, but as a general matter, that was already in place. But Americans do not want to deport undocumented immigrants who haven't committed crimes. They want them to have a path to citizenship. And they do not want people who've lived here for a long time without committing crimes to be deported. They want them to have a path to citizenship. So Trump is actually flying in the face of those two things, which is one of the reasons he's so trying to convince people that Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who has both been in this country a long time and works full time, is married, has 3 kids, and has never been charged with a crime is a criminal, because this is why Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a really big deal for a lot of even MAGA people saying, hey, we didn't sign up for that. This dude's been here since he was 15 years old because he was avoiding a gang that was trying to kill him to get a cut of his parents' business, is their food business. And he works full time. He's a member of a union. He's got a wife. He's got kids. He's never been charged with a crime. You're not supposed to go after him. And this is why they're trying to repaint him as something else. So the immigration thing is the only place where Trump's a little bit not what we call underwater. And when people talk in politics about being underwater, it means that you are more people disapprove of you than approve of you. And Trump's huge albatross around his neck, which, by the way, I'm sorry, I miss my literature degree, comes from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, that very famous old poem. A guy shoots an albatross when they're out on the water, and an albatross is a symbol of good luck. So you shoot an albatross, you have bad luck, and they get stuck in the doldrums, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. In order to punish him for having brought bad luck to their ship, they tie the albatross around his neck. So if you've, in the poem of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, so if you hear it's an albatross around someone's neck, it means it's something that you have done bad that is now you're stuck with it because you've got this rotting bird around your neck. Little digression, but as I say, I really miss literature. The economy. Listen, all Trump had to do was drink Mai Tais or Diet Cokes on the golf course and let Biden's economy take off, because it was doing that. It was taking off. All kinds of foreign investment, all kinds of, new plants being started. Employment could not really have gotten lower than it was. Wages rising. For all that people thought Biden's economy was bad, what many of us observers thought was going to happen was that Trump was just going to sit back for 3 months and then take credit for Biden's economy. Say, see, I fixed everything. And everybody would say, oh my God, you're right. The economy's great. Thank you so much. And, the Democrats would tear their hair out being like, well, we did that. And everybody would say, who are you again? That's all he had to do. But instead, he is determined to create what somehow in his mind is this great moment of the 1890s with tariff walls. Tariffs are not bad or good. They're tools. But you can't suddenly throw up tariff walls around a country and expect manufacturing to take over for everything that you had previously accomplished through global trade in-house. Even if we started a factory outside my window today, and of course, we don't have financing, we don't have permission, we don't have any of those things yet, it would take 3 to 5 years to get it functioning. And he just doesn't seem to understand that. And so what he has done is not only this terrible hit to the stock market, which is what's really making the headlines, which hurts, of course, people's retirement funds and their pension funds and government pension funds, and the government, state and local government accounts, which we're going to be using to pay for things like road improvements. Those have all taken a terrible hit. It's also those right now we're only operating with that being the problem. The other problem is that these tariff walls are going to hit in May and June. And when they do that, people are going to lose their jobs. We're already looking at the drop of imports and freight boats, freighters to the Port of Los Angeles, which is one of our biggest ports. I was just actually in San Francisco. It's another big port. But, you got these tankers coming in all the time, and they're huge, and they're full of what are essentially the boxes that go on the back of a tractor trailer truck. 44% down for I think it's May. It might be June. I think it's May. They're down 44%. That means that not only are people not going to get things to make their products, for example, but also truckers are going to be hit by that, and freight trains are going to be hit by that, and stores are going to be hit by that. We're looking at a summer of real shortages. Now, why am I mentioning that? Because Trump is weak now. He's already underwater significantly. His numbers are plummeting. When that hits, he's going to be really weak indeed and is going to get weaker. And not only that, of course, but between the stock market and then the bond market, and the reason the bond market matters, I mean, it matters for many reasons, but one of the reasons people like me watch it is because usually when stocks got wonky, people jumped into the American bond market because it was the most secure market. It was called a safe haven. The US was a safe haven for money. You'd put it here rather than in, a war-torn country, for example. We've lost that, or at least we're in the process of losing it. People are putting their money instead into Germany, among other places. And that has huge repercussions, because one of the great things about being the country of safe haven was we got really good interest rates, for example, on borrowing money. And it was a great way to keep money coming in. Instead, money is flowing out of the country. Those are all really bad signs for the economy. But what it also means is that in terms of stopping this administration from destroying the United States of America, you need to remember they are not all powerful. To the contrary, they're actually very weak right now, and they're only going to get weaker. So what does pushing back look like? It looks like somebody asked about the idea of an Article 5 constitutional convention. Absolutely not. Not. Because remember that the Constitution we got was because of a constitutional convention that was only supposed to change one or two things. And instead, they tore it up and rewrote the whole thing. If you did that now, and you had the states, for example, sending delegates, the states that are so extraordinarily gerrymandered and suppressing the vote, you would get a right wing or even a fascist constitution. I just have no doubt of that. What we need to do is to stand on the Constitution we have right now in this moment, but also crucially to envision the country we want, because we are not ever going back to January 19th of 2025. That world has been ripped up. And that's a terrible thing in very many ways, but it also gives us the opportunity to fix the many things that were broken. And, you can probably think in your minds of a list of things that you would change. Personally, you don't have to agree with me. This is what this is all about. I would like to see universal health care. I would like to see much higher taxes on the higher income brackets. I would like to see stronger regulation of pollution, for example. Those are things that I care about. You have a different list. That's fine. Let's throw it on the table and see which of those ideas are popular. I was just reading today that 80% of Americans want us to address climate change, but we all think we're the only ones who think that way. So, speaking up about those things to help us envision a future is going to be incredibly important in this moment. So let me go with one more thing, and that's, what do we do? We are doing it. So people have talked about how the protests seem largely to be older white people. This is good. It will be very hard for the Trump administration to look at, little old white ladies like me standing out there and say that we are dangerous radicals who need to be imprisoned or attacked. It's much easier with their base to say that about young men and people of color. So having older white people in the front lines is a great thing. And I encourage you, if you feel safe, to do that. I've gone to a couple of these protests, and I will continue to do so. That's not a bad thing necessarily. And remember that people, just because they're not in the streets, doesn't mean they're not organizing. And that's certainly the case. You're seeing people, you're seeing attorneys general, you're seeing lawyers, you're seeing different organizations stand up to the Trump administration legally. But also you are seeing people protesting by getting involved, by running for school board, or by sitting at school board meetings, or going to town meetings, or supporting different representatives in the states, working with the state government, going to state Republicans and saying, are you really okay with an autism registry when you weren't okay with a gun registry? I mean, let's actually move some people on the ground here. So continuing to speak up in those ways is crucially important, because once again, the American government depends on power that we, the people, quite literally, we, the people in the Constitution, gave to them. And if we demonstrate that they don't have that, that opens up the way for a lot of other people to push back in much more productive ways in the immediate sense. Now, in the long term sense, we've got it covered because younger, and I don't necessarily mean in age, but newer politicians will hear us and they will step up to represent us. But in the shorter term, speaking up to Republicans as well as Democrats about things you're upset about is enormously important. In that thing I did with Senator King, he said, every day, call us, put pressure on us, let us know what you want, because that's how you're going to help me, in the way he was talking, switch Republicans in the Senate, because we really don't need that many people in the Senate and the House to start standing up against this administration, to start making things happen. So really do continue to speak up and to make your opinions known to the people in our government, even become a person in our government. But somebody said something the other day that really jumped out to me, and that's that if you are trying to change the way people think, and I talk a lot about social media, it wouldn't hurt to think about the ice bucket challenge. You know how that went kind of viral for a while there in support of money for funding research for a disease. I'm afraid I don't even remember which disease it was now. Um, Short videos talking about how this administration is affecting you personally, um, and sharing them on social media so that people feel comfortable doing it is an incredibly effective tool for other people to understand that they are not alone. And as they say, courage is contagious. And the more of us who speak up, the more of us will speak up. Because again, if you look at the poll numbers, Donald Trump and his administration and what they are doing are deeply unpopular. But an awful lot of people just want to say, I don't want to get involved. This isn't going to matter to me. If they hear your story about why it's important to you, maybe they'll do the same thing. So I would urge you to think about that as a way to resist as well. So I think I've gone on now for a full hour. I have to go on to something else, but keep the faith on this one. I know it sucks. I'm sorry. I know it's really hard when you read the news and it's just one terrible thing after another. But, listen, it's still work time across the rest of this country, and we have 25,000 people on this Zoom alone. And this is happening all over the country. You're not alone, and your voice matters, and we have the agency to change the future, and we must. Because if we don't, the future that the Trump administration, with its three different divisions, is proposing for us is dystopian. It's one of those things where lots of us wish, and I'll speak for myself alone here, really wish that our lives had not come to this moment, you know, when I think of what I could have done with my life, if I had been able to move the ball forward instead of trying to stop it from moving backward, I get really resentful. But this is the world we're in, and we have to step up, because if we don't, it's not going to get better. And if we do, there's a really good chance that it will. So while it's miserable to listen to this stuff and to have to deal with this stuff, do know that we are in this together, and that as dark as it seems, the curtains have not yet shut. The world has not yet abandoned American democracy, and we still have the chance to make our wishes heard. So let's go do it. Thank you for being here. And I will, again, I keep saying I'm going to try and do these more frequently. I come off the road in about a week, and that'll make such a big difference for me. Thank you for being here.